Some of the strangest discoveries in history were never meant to be found. A massive footprint carved into ancient stone in South Africa. A mysterious metal sphere discovered in the forests of Florida. A waterfall where half an entire river simply disappears into the earth. Across caves, deserts, mountains, and forgotten ruins, there are mysteries that still leave historians searching for answers. So, wherever you're watching from tonight, and whatever time it is where you are, settle in and join me as we explore some of the most fascinating mysteries hidden throughout history. The giant footprint of Mpuluzi. In the hills of Mpumalanga in eastern South Africa, not far from the border with Eswatini, there is a rock formation that has puzzled visitors for decades. Carved into a slab of granite is a shape that looks unmistakably familiar, a human footprint. But it is far larger than any ordinary track. The impression measures roughly 1.2 meters in length, far longer than the foot of even the tallest modern human. The shape is clear enough that visitors immediately recognize the outline of toes, the curve of the arch, and the heel pressed into stone. At first glance, it looks as if someone, or something, stepped onto the rock while it was still soft, and left a footprint behind. The formation is often referred to as the giant footprint of Mpuluzi, named after the nearby Mpuluzi River that flows through this region of rolling hills and exposed rock formations. Local guides sometimes describe it as one of the largest human-like footprints ever discovered in stone. Naturally, such a claim sparks imagination. If this really were a footprint left by a living creature, the being that made it would have been enormous. A track that large suggests a body several meters tall, far beyond the size of any known human ancestor. Stories quickly followed. Some visitors speculate about ancient giants that once walked the earth. Others suggest lost civilizations or mysterious beings from forgotten eras. A few even imagine that the track might be evidence of creatures described in ancient legends. But when geologists examine the formation more closely, a different explanation begins to emerge. The rock in this region is ancient granite, a hard, igneous rock formed deep beneath the Earth's surface millions of years ago. Granite does not behave like soft mud or wet sand, which means footprints cannot simply be pressed into it by walking across the surface. Instead, granite shapes are created through weathering over very long periods of time. Wind, water, temperature changes, and chemical reactions slowly break down the outer layers of exposed rock. These processes do not always erode stone evenly. Some minerals wear away faster than others, leaving behind unusual depressions and shapes. In the case of the Mpuluzi footprint, the formation appears to be a natural erosion feature. A combination of fractures in the granite and gradual weathering likely created the hollow that now resembles the outline of a human foot. Once the shape appeared, our brains did the rest. Humans are extremely good at recognizing patterns, especially familiar ones like faces, animals, or footprints. Psychologists call this phenomenon pareidolia, the tendency to see meaningful shapes in random patterns. The same process allows people to see faces in clouds or animals in rock formations. The Mpuluzi footprint is a striking example of this effect. Yet the fact that the formation is probably natural does not make it any less interesting. On the contrary, it reveals something important about the relationship between humans and landscape. When ancient people encountered unusual features in nature, they often created stories to explain them. Rock formations became sacred sites, landmarks, or symbols of legendary events. Across the world, many natural shapes have inspired myths of giants, gods, or heroes who once walked the land. In South Africa, the Mpumalanga region itself holds an incredibly deep human history. Archaeological evidence shows that humans and their ancestors have lived in southern Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. The nearby mountains and valleys contain ancient rock art created by sand hunter-gatherers, some of which dates back thousands of years. These early artists painted animals, hunting scenes, and spiritual imagery on cave walls throughout the region. Their connection to the land was profound. Every valley, river, and rock formation had meaning. It is easy to imagine that unusual shapes like the Mpuluzi footprint might also have carried symbolic importance. Even if the depression formed naturally, people living in the landscape may have seen it as a mark left by a powerful being or a spirit connected to the earth. Today, the site attracts curious travelers and local visitors who come to see the footprint for themselves. Standing beside it, the impression does appear remarkably detailed. The toes are rounded, the arch dips inward, the heel presses deeper at the back. The resemblance to a human track is almost uncanny, but the surrounding rock tells another story. Fine cracks run through the granite surface. Mineral variations create subtle color differences, showing where the stone has weathered unevenly over long periods. Rainwater collects briefly in the depression during wet seasons, slowly deepening the hollow over time. Nature is patient, and over thousands of years, even the hardest rock can be sculpted into shapes that seem deliberate. This is part of what makes geological landscapes so fascinating. They often produce forms that mimic human design, terraces that look like steps, pillars that resemble buildings, and patterns that feel intentional. Yet they arise from processes far older than human history. The Mpuluzi footprint reminds us that not every mystery requires an extraordinary explanation. Sometimes the real story is the quiet work of time. Wind passing over exposed granite, rain seeping into microscopic cracks, heat expanding the rock during the day, cold tightening it again at night, year after year, century after century, until eventually a hollow appears, a shape that happens to resemble a giant human step frozen in stone. And when people encounter it for the first time, standing among the rolling hills of Mpumalanga, it sparks the same question that unusual landscapes have inspired throughout history. Could someone really have walked here long ago, or is it simply the earth itself, Chi'itiu, shaping stone into forms that invite our imagination to wander? Either way, the giant footprint of Mpuluzi remains a reminder of how easily natural landscapes can blur the boundary between geology and legend, leaving behind shapes that feel almost human, even when they were carved only by time. The Dover Demon, 1977. In the spring of 1977, the quiet town of Dover, Massachusetts was the kind of place where very little unusual ever happened. It was a small New England community surrounded by woods, winding country roads, and old stone walls that had stood in the landscape for centuries. At night, the town grew even quieter. Streetlights were sparse, the roads were dark, and beyond the headlights of passing cars, the forest seemed to close in on every side. It was here, over the course of 2 nights in April of that year, that several teenagers reported seeing something they could not explain. A small, strange creature that would later become known as the Dover Demon. The first sighting happened on the night of April 21st, 1977. 17-year-old Bill Bartlett was driving along Farm Street, a narrow road that wound through wooded hills just outside town. Riding with him were 2 friends, Mike Mazoka and Andy Brody. It was late evening, the kind of slow drive teenagers often took through rural areas where there was little traffic and little else to do. As Bartlett's car approached a small bridge along the road, his headlights swept across a low stone wall, and something moved. At first he thought it was an animal, perhaps a cat or raccoon perched along the top of the wall. But as the car drew closer, the shape became clearer, illuminated for just a moment by the headlights. What Bartlett described later was not any animal he recognized. Perched on the wall was a small humanoid figure, with an unusually large head and thin limbs. Its skin appeared pale or gray, almost hairless, and its eyes were large and glowing in the reflected light. The creature seemed to grip the stones with long fingers, balancing in a crouched position. Bartlett slowed the car instinctively. The figure did not run. Instead, it turned its head toward the vehicle. For a few seconds, the creature and the car were facing each other in the beam of the headlights. Then the moment passed. Bartlett continued driving, unsure of exactly what he had just seen. Later that night, he sketched the creature from memory, carefully drawing the large head long arms, and thin body that had startled him on the roadside. At the time, the story might have remained nothing more than a strange encounter shared between friends. But the next night, another sighting occurred. This time, the witness was 15-year-old John Baxter. Late in the evening of April 22nd, Baxter was walking along Miller Hill Road on his way home after visiting a friend. The road was quiet and poorly lit, bordered by woods and old farmland. As he walked, Baxter noticed a small figure standing ahead of him in the distance. At first, he assumed it was another person, but as he approached, he began to realize something was wrong. The figure appeared unusually small, with an oddly shaped head that seemed much larger than its body. It stood upright but moved awkwardly, almost as if it were unfamiliar with walking. Baxter described the creature as having long arms and legs, thin like sticks, and a smooth head with large glowing eyes. Startled, he called out. The creature reacted immediately. It turned and moved off into the darkness beside the road, climbing down into a wood gully with surprising speed. Baxter later described the moment as both frightening and confusing. Whatever he had seen did not match any animal he knew, yet it also did not behave exactly like a human. Later that same night, a third witness reported seeing something similar. 16-year-old Abby Brabham and her friend Will Tainter were driving along Springdale Avenue when they spotted a small creature crouched near the roadside. According to Brabham's account, the figure had a large head and glowing eyes, and it appeared to move in a strange, deliberate way before disappearing into nearby trees. 3 sightings, 2 nights, multiple witnesses describing nearly the same unusual figure. Local newspapers quickly picked up the story. Reporters interviewed the teenagers and published Bartlett's sketch of the creature, which soon became the most recognizable image associated with the Dover demon. The drawing showed a thin, humanoid form with a disproportionately large head and long limbs, perched on a stone wall with glowing eyes reflecting the car's headlights. Naturally, speculation followed. Some people suggested the witnesses had simply seen a young animal, perhaps a deer, a fox, or even a hairless dog, misinterpreted in the darkness. Others wondered if the sightings might be connected to the wave of UFO reports that had captured public imagination during the 1970s. And some believed the witnesses had encountered something entirely unknown. What made the case unusual was the consistency of the descriptions. The witnesses were interviewed separately, yet their accounts shared several key features. The creature's small size, its large head, thin limbs, and bright reflective eyes. None of the witnesses knew each other well before the sightings, and none gained anything by reporting what they saw. Investigators from the New England Skeptical Society and other groups later examined the reports carefully. Their conclusion was that the sightings were likely the result of misidentified animals, seen briefly in poor lighting conditions. In rural areas at night, the reflective eyes of animals can appear unusually bright under headlights. Deer, for example, often freeze momentarily when illuminated by a vehicle, creating strange silhouettes against the dark. But even with these explanations, the story remained memorable, perhaps because of how brief the sightings were. Each witness saw the creature only for a moment, just long enough to recognize that it looked unusual, not long enough to understand exactly what it was. Over the years, the Dover demon has become part of New England folklore, often compared to other mysterious creatures reported in different regions. Yet the case remains small and oddly quiet compared with more famous cryptid legends. There were no additional sightings in the days that followed. No physical evidence was ever discovered. The creature, whatever it was, appeared only briefly in the spring of 1977, and then it vanished. Today the town of Dover remains peaceful, its roads still winding through forested hills much as they did decades ago. Farm Street and Miller Hill Road are ordinary rural roads where nothing particularly unusual happens. But every so often, someone retells the story. About the teenager driving past a stone wall late at night. About the strange figure perched in the headlights. About the moment when the creature turned its large head and looked back, just for a few seconds, long enough to become one of the strangest small-town mysteries in New England history. The Horned Skull Burial of Sayre, Pennsylvania. In the late 19th century, during a period when archaeology was still developing into a scientific discipline, newspapers across the United States occasionally published stories about unusual discoveries from burial mounds scattered throughout the countryside. Some of these reports were exaggerated, others were misunderstood, and a few remain strangely difficult to verify even today. One of the most curious stories appeared in 1880 near the town of Sayre, Pennsylvania, a small community along the New York border. At the time, workers were excavating a group of ancient burial mounds in the surrounding hills, structures believed to have been built centuries earlier by indigenous cultures of North America. Burial mounds are common throughout the eastern United States. Many were constructed by societies belonging to what archaeologists now call the Adena, Hopewell, or later Mississippian cultural traditions. These communities built earthen mounds for ceremonial purposes, burials, and territorial markers long before European settlement in the region. When the Sayre mounds were opened, the excavators reportedly uncovered several human skeletons buried deep within the earth. But one skull in particular drew attention. According to the report, the skull possessed unusual bony protrusions extending from the forehead, structures described as horn-like growths rising several centimeters above the bone surface. The skeleton itself was also said to be unusually tall, possibly exceeding 7 feet in height. If accurate, the find would have been extraordinary. Human skulls do sometimes develop abnormal growths. Certain medical conditions can produce bone formations known as osteomas or other cranial deformities, which appear as protrusions or ridges along the skull. But the description of symmetrical horn-like structures was unusual enough to capture public imagination. Newspapers quickly circulated the story. The idea of a horned human skull seemed to echo ancient myths and folklore found in many cultures. Stories of horned figures, spirits, or supernatural beings whose physical features blurred the line between human and myth. Yet the archaeological context of the discovery was never clearly documented. The excavation itself was not conducted under modern scientific standards. During the 19th century, many mound explorations were carried out by amateur researchers, collectors, or local curiosity seekers rather than trained archaeologists. Records were often incomplete, artifacts were sometimes removed without proper cataloging, and human remains were occasionally lost or dispersed among private collections. Because of this, verifying the Sayre discovery today is difficult. No confirmed specimen matching the description of the horned skull exists in major museum collections. The original bones reportedly examined by researchers at the time were never formally preserved within a recognized institution. This absence has led many historians to treat the report with caution. Some researchers suggest the story may have originated from misinterpretation of skeletal remains. In certain cases, erosion or damage to a skull can create shapes that resemble protrusions. When soil compresses bones over long periods, fragments can shift and distort, producing unusual outlines when excavated. Others believe the story may have been exaggerated by newspapers seeking sensational headlines, something not uncommon during the late 19th century. Yet, there is another possibility. The skull described in the report may have belonged to an individual with a rare medical condition that produced abnormal bone growth. Conditions such as hyperostosis or benign bone tumors can create unusual protrusions on the skull. While they rarely resemble horns exactly, early observers unfamiliar with medical terminology might easily describe them in more dramatic terms. Regardless of the explanation, the Sayre story reflects a broader chapter in North American archaeology. During the 19th century, the ancient mound builders of the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys were still poorly understood by the wider public. Many people believed the mounds must have been constructed by a lost civilization unrelated to Native American societies. This misconception persisted until systematic archaeological research demonstrated that indigenous cultures themselves built the mounds over thousands of years. The Sayre excavation occurred during that transitional period, a time when curiosity about ancient America was growing, but scientific standards were still evolving. stories of giant skeletons, unusual skulls, and mysterious artifacts were not uncommon in newspapers of the era. Some discoveries were real but misunderstood, others were embellished, and a few remained unresolved simply because the original evidence disappeared. Today, the burial mounds near Sayre are quiet reminders of that early phase of American archaeology. The landscape itself holds layers of human history stretching back long before written records in the region. Indigenous mound-building cultures developed complex societies with ceremonial architecture, trade networks, and burial traditions that lasted for centuries. The true achievements of these cultures are impressive enough without the need for legends. Still, the story of the horned skull continues to circulate in historical curiosities and local folklore, not because it proves the existence of unknown human species or mythical beings, but because it illustrates how easily unusual discoveries can blur the boundary between scientific investigation and imagination. Standing on a quiet hillside where a burial mound once rose above the earth, it is easy to understand how 19th century excavators might have felt when they uncovered ancient bones beneath the soil. For them, the past was still mysterious. Every artifact hinted at forgotten worlds. Every skeleton seemed to raise new questions. And occasionally a discovery appeared so unusual that it lingered in memory long after the physical evidence itself had vanished. The horned skull of Sayre may never be fully explained, but the story remains a reminder of how archaeology has changed, evolving from scattered curiosity into a careful science dedicated to understanding the lives of people who came before us. Sometimes the mysteries fade as knowledge grows, and sometimes they simply become part of the long, fascinating history of how we search for the past. The San Pedro Mountain Mummy. In the rugged landscape of central Wyoming, the San Pedro Mountains rise quietly above the surrounding plains, their rocky slopes and hidden caves forming part of a landscape that has held human stories for thousands of years. It was here, in 1932, that two prospectors searching for gold made a discovery that would quickly become one of the strangest archaeological stories in American history. The men, Cecil Main and Frank Carr, had been working in a remote area of the mountains when they decided to use explosives to open a section of rock where they believed mineral veins might be hidden. The blast shattered part of the cliff face and exposed a small, sealed cave that had previously been completely hidden within the stone. When the dust cleared and the men entered the cavity, they found something unexpected sitting inside. On a small natural ledge within the cave was a tiny human-like figure. At first glance, it appeared to be a miniature mummy, preserved in a seated position with its legs crossed and arms resting along its sides. The figure measured only about 18 centimeters tall, roughly the size of a small doll, yet its features were unmistakably human. The head was slightly bowed forward. The face showed a flattened nose, thin lips, and a somewhat wrinkled appearance, as though the skin had dried over time. The eyes appeared closed, and the top of the skull seemed flattened in a way that suggested possible injury or deformation. The tiny figure looked almost like a shrunken adult. Main and Carr were stunned. The cave itself was small and sealed, with no obvious entrance before the blast. Whatever had been placed inside had likely remained there for a very long time. The men carefully removed the mummy and eventually brought it to nearby towns, where the discovery began attracting attention. Soon, the tiny figure became known as the San Pedro Mountain Mummy. News of the discovery spread quickly through Wyoming and neighboring states. Curious residents, journalists, and researchers all came to see the small figure, which was sometimes displayed in local venues while investigators attempted to determine what it might be. The most striking detail was its size. If it truly represented a human body, the proportion suggested an individual no larger than about a foot tall. Yet the skeletal structure visible beneath the preserved skin seemed fully formed, more like that of an adult than an infant. Some observers speculated that the mummy might belong to a previously unknown species of tiny humans, an idea that resonated with indigenous folklore from the region. Several Native American traditions from the Rocky Mountain area include stories of small supernatural beings, sometimes described as little people. Among the Shoshone and other tribes, legends speak of tiny warriors who lived in remote mountain caves and possessed unusual abilities. These beings were often portrayed as powerful spirits rather than ordinary humans. The resemblance between the mummy and those legends quickly captured the public imagination, but scientists approached the discovery with more caution. In the 1940s, researchers were finally able to examine the mummy more closely using X-ray imaging. The scans revealed a small skeleton inside the preserved tissue, including a spine, rib cage, and skull. The bones appeared to belong to a human. However, the X-rays also showed something important. The skeleton displayed characteristics of an infant or very young child rather than a fully grown adult. The apparent adult features seen on the surface, the wrinkled skin and seated posture, were likely the result of natural mummification and dehydration over time. The flattened shape of the skull also became clearer through examination. It appeared that the skull had been crushed or damaged at some point, possibly by falling rock inside the cave or by geological pressure over long periods. This injury may have contributed to the unusual appearance of the head. Based on these findings, most researchers concluded that the San Pedro mountain mummy was likely the naturally mummified remains of a human infant or fetus, possibly affected by developmental abnormalities that influenced bone growth. In rare cases, congenital conditions can produce unusual skeletal proportions that may appear strange when viewed without context. Still, several questions remain difficult to answer. The cave where the mummy was discovered had been sealed within solid rock before the explosion that opened it. This suggests that the remains may have been placed there intentionally, perhaps as part of a burial practice. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient peoples across North America sometimes used caves as burial locations. These spaces could preserve bodies unusually well because of stable temperature, dryness, and limited airflow. Over centuries, natural mummification could occur without deliberate embalming. Unfortunately, the exact location of the original cave was not carefully documented at the time of discovery, which makes modern archaeological investigation difficult. The mummy itself also disappeared from scientific study after changing hands several times in private collections during the mid-20th century. For many years, researchers did not know where it was. Some believed it had been lost completely. In more recent decades, historians traced the mummy to private owners who occasionally allowed limited examination, though the specimen has never been permanently placed in a public museum collection. This lack of continuous documentation means the mystery surrounding the San Pedro Mountain mummy has never been fully resolved. What remains clear, however, is that the discovery illustrates how unusual natural preservation can transform human remains into something that appears almost mythical. A small mummified body, dried and compressed by time, can easily look unfamiliar when removed from its original context. And when such a discovery emerges suddenly from a sealed cave in a remote mountain range, the imagination naturally fills in the gaps. Today, the San Pedro Mountains remain as rugged and quiet as they were in 1932. Their slopes still contain caves and hidden chambers formed by geological processes over millions of years. Some of those caves may yet hold archaeological traces of people who once traveled through the region long before modern prospectors arrived. The tiny mummy discovered there continues to occupy an unusual place in American folklore, not because it proves the existence of miniature humans or mythical cave dwellers, but because it reminds us how fragile and mysterious the archaeological record can be. Sometimes the most surprising discoveries are also the most easily misunderstood, and sometimes a single small figure preserved quietly in a cave for generations can spark questions that echo far beyond the mountains where it was first found. The disappearance of the Flannan Isles, lighthouse keepers. Far out in the North Atlantic, west of the Scottish mainland, a small group of rocky islands rises from the ocean. These are the Flannan Isles, isolated, wind-swept, and surrounded by waters that are often rough even in calm weather. Among them stands a lonely lighthouse on the island of Island Moor. It was built at the end of the 19th century to guide ships safely through one of the most dangerous stretches of sea along the Atlantic edge of Scotland. The lighthouse itself was modern for its time, automated with clockwork machinery and designed to withstand powerful storms. But in December of 1900, something happened here that would turn this quiet outpost into one of the most enduring maritime mysteries in history. 3 lighthouse keepers disappeared, and no one has ever been able to explain exactly how. The lighthouse had been operating normally during the early days of December. The keepers stationed there were Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur. They were experienced men accustomed to the isolation and routine of lighthouse life. Typically, 3 keepers would work in rotation while a 4th remained on shore, ready to relieve them during scheduled supply visits. The system had worked reliably for years. But on December 15th, something unusual happened. A passing ship traveling through the area reported that the lighthouse light, which should have been visible from miles away, was dark. At first, this did not immediately trigger alarm. Weather conditions in the region could sometimes delay routine maintenance or affect visibility. But when the scheduled relief vessel, the Hesperus, finally arrived at the island on December 26th, the situation became more troubling. The lighthouse showed no sign of activity. Normally, when a supply vessel approached, one of the keepers would be waiting at the landing area to receive it. This time there was no one. The captain sounded the ship's horn. No response. Eventually the relief keeper, Joseph Moore, went ashore alone to investigate. He climbed the steep path leading from the landing to the lighthouse buildings. The wind moved through the grass and the ocean thundered against the cliffs below. Everything appeared quiet. Too quiet. When Moore reached the lighthouse, he noticed something immediately strange. The entrance door was closed. But inside, the rooms looked as if the keepers had vanished suddenly. The kitchen table held uneaten food. A chair was overturned. One of the oilskin coats usually worn by the keepers during bad weather was missing, but the others remained hanging inside. Most unusual of all, the lighthouse clock had stopped. Moore searched the buildings. The men were nowhere to be found. A full investigation soon followed. Inspectors examined every part of the lighthouse and the surrounding island. The light mechanism itself appeared intact, though it had not been maintained for several days. Logs kept by the lighthouse staff contained entries describing severe storms earlier in the month. Yet meteorological records from nearby areas suggested that the weather during that time may not have been as extreme as the logs implied. The final entry, dated December 15th, mentioned winds calming after several days of rough conditions. After that, the record ended. No sign of the 3 men was ever discovered. Search teams combed the cliffs, the shoreline, and the nearby waters. No bodies were recovered. No clear evidence of an accident was found. The official explanation eventually proposed that a powerful wave may have swept the men into the sea while they were securing equipment near the western landing platform, an area exposed to enormous Atlantic swells. The island's cliffs rise sharply from the ocean, and during storms, waves can surge high enough to wash across parts of the rock. Investigators noted that ropes and boxes used for cargo lifting had been displaced, suggesting that the keepers might have been attempting to secure equipment when a sudden wave struck. In that scenario, one man might have been pulled into the water, while the others rushed to help. All 3 could have been swept away. It was a plausible explanation, but it left certain details unresolved. Why would all 3 keepers leave the lighthouse at the same time, when regulations required at least 1 man to remain inside at all times to maintain the light? Why was only 1 oilskin coat missing? And why did the scene inside the lighthouse suggest such sudden abandonment? Over the years, the disappearance of the Flannan Isles keepers has inspired countless theories. Some suggest that a rogue wave, far larger than normal waves, struck the island unexpectedly. Others speculate about accidents, disputes between the men, or even psychological strain caused by the extreme isolation of lighthouse duty. The Atlantic surrounding the Flannan Isles can be unforgiving. Even experienced sailors have been caught off guard by the sudden force of its storms. Yet despite all investigations and speculation, the truth of what happened during those final hours in December 1900 remains unknown. Today, the lighthouse on Island Moor still stands. It was automated in 1971, removing the need for keepers to live on the island. The buildings remain as silent witnesses to the events of more than a century ago. Ships still pass through the waters nearby, guided by the light that continues to shine across the Atlantic. But when people speak of the Flannan Isles, they often remember the story of the three men who simply disappeared. No struggle, no farewell, just an empty lighthouse overlooking the sea. The Waffle Rock Mystery. In the wooded hills of Putnam County, West Virginia, not far from the small community of Hurricane, there is a rock formation that looks almost impossible at first glance. From a distance it appears ordinary, just another large slab of stone resting quietly among trees and rolling Appalachian terrain. But as visitors step closer, the surface reveals something unusual. The rock is covered in a grid. Perfectly spaced ridges intersect each other at right angles, creating hundreds of small square depressions across the stone. The pattern looks so regular that many people compare it to the surface of a waffle iron. That is exactly where the site's nickname comes from. It is known simply as Waffle Rock. At first sight, the formation seems almost artificial. The squares appear evenly spaced, and the intersecting lines create a pattern that feels designed rather than accidental. To someone encountering it for the first time, the stone might easily resemble the foundation of an ancient structure or the imprint of some forgotten machine. Naturally, this has led to speculation. Some visitors have suggested that the rock could be evidence of an ancient construction technique, perhaps the remains of a lost stone pavement or the base of a long eroded building. Others have proposed more imaginative explanations, imagining prehistoric civilizations carving geometric patterns into stone for unknown purposes. But the true story of Waffle Rock begins not with ancient builders, but with geology. The rock itself is a type of sandstone known as the Kanawha Formation, deposited during the Pennsylvanian period, roughly 300 million years ago. At that time, the region that is now West Virginia was part of a vast lowland environment filled with rivers, swamps, and sediment-rich floodplains. Layers of sand and mud accumulated over long stretches of time, eventually compressing into the sedimentary rock that forms much of the Appalachian region today. Within these layers, natural stresses gradually created fractures known as joints. Joints are cracks in rock that form as pressure builds and releases deep within the Earth's crust. Unlike faults, they do not involve major movement of rock layers. Instead, they simply divide the stone into blocks along natural lines of weakness. In the case of Waffle Rock, two sets of joints formed within the sandstone at nearly right angles to each other. Over millions of years, erosion began to exploit those cracks. Rainwater seeped into the joints. Freeze and thaw cycles widened them. Wind and flowing water gradually wore away the softer material along the fracture lines. As the cracks expanded, the rock surface began to break down along those intersecting lines, creating the raised ridges and recessed squares visible today. What looks like a carved grid is actually a natural pattern formed by the intersection of geological fractures. The process is sometimes referred to as joint-controlled weathering. Similar patterns can appear in other sedimentary rocks around the world, though few examples are as visually striking as Waffle Rock. The near-perfect alignment of the joints and the uniform erosion along them created a pattern that feels unusually precise, which is exactly why it attracts attention. Humans instinctively associate straight lines and grids with intentional design. We build roads, cities, and buildings using right angles and regular patterns. When nature produces something similar, it often feels surprising. Yet, geology is capable of remarkable symmetry. Basalt columns can form hexagonal pillars. Sandstone can fracture into rectangular blocks. And under the right conditions, Intersecting joints can produce patterns that resemble engineered structures. Waffle rock became widely known in the early 20th century when local residents began pointing it out to visitors traveling through the area. Eventually, the site was preserved as a small roadside attraction, allowing people to examine the unusual pattern up close. Today, the rock sits beneath a protective shelter along a quiet stretch of road. Visitors can walk right up to it and run their hands across the raised ridges, tracing the squares that cover its surface. The pattern extends across several meters of stone, forming a textured grid that seems almost too regular to be accidental. But the deeper story of the formation reminds us that natural processes often operate on timescales far beyond human experience. 300 million years ago, the land that would become West Virginia looked nothing like it does today. Rivers wandered through tropical swamps, carrying sediment that slowly settled into layers. Those layers hardened into stone. Pressure built within the Earth's crust. Cracks formed. Water seeped through the fractures. And over millions of years, erosion carved the intersecting lines that now create the waffle-like pattern. What appears, at first glance, to be the work of ancient builders is actually the quiet result of geological forces acting patiently over immense spans of time. Still, the formation continues to inspire curiosity, because even when science explains how something formed, the visual impact remains powerful. Standing beside Waffle Rock, looking down at the repeating squares etched into stone, it is easy to imagine how early visitors might have believed they were seeing the remains of something constructed. A pavement, a foundation, perhaps even a mysterious artifact from a distant past. Instead, the rock reveals something equally fascinating: the ability of natural processes to produce patterns so orderly that they challenge our expectations of what nature should look like. And in the wooded hills of West Virginia, that quiet grid of stone continues to puzzle and fascinate everyone who stops to look a little closer. The Toynbee Tile Messages. In the middle of busy city streets, surrounded by traffic, noise, and asphalt, there is a message that has puzzled people for decades. It is not written on a sign, not painted on a wall. Instead, it is embedded directly into the pavement. Drivers pass over it every day without noticing. Pedestrians might glimpse it only briefly as they cross an intersection, but those who stop and read the message quickly realize that it raises more questions than answers. These strange street messages are known as the Toynbee Tiles. The tiles began appearing during the 1980s in several American cities, particularly in Philadelphia, where many of the earliest examples were discovered. Eventually, similar tiles were found in other cities as well, including New York, Washington, D.C., Boston, and even locations far outside the United States. Each tile carried a cryptic statement pressed into the asphalt. The wording varied slightly between examples, but many displayed a version of the same strange message. Toynbee, idea in movie. 2001 resurrect dead on planet Jupiter. The message was always arranged in block letters, usually made from small colored tiles or pieces of linoleum embedded into the road surface. The materials were pressed into soft asphalt so that traffic would gradually seal them into place. The effect made the message look as though it had been permanently fused into the street itself. But what did it mean? The phrase immediately raises several mysteries. First, the reference to Toynbee. Most researchers believe this refers to Arnold Toynbee, a 20th century British historian known for his massive work, A Study of History. Toynbee wrote extensively about the rise and fall of civilizations and the patterns that shape human history. Yet Toynbee himself never wrote anything about resurrecting the dead on Jupiter. The second reference appears to be the film 2001, A Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick and released in 1968. The movie explores themes of evolution, artificial intelligence, and humanity's future among the stars. But again, the film does not contain any direct discussion of resurrecting the dead on Jupiter. So why combine these two references in a mysterious message placed in city streets? Over the years, investigators have tried to trace the origin of the tiles. Some of the earliest known examples appeared in Philadelphia in the early 1980s. At first, they were small and simple, but later versions became more elaborate, including additional text and strange coded notes. Certain tiles even included references to political conspiracies or media organizations. One of the most common theories points to a man named James Marasco, a Philadelphia resident who reportedly spoke in local radio shows about unusual interpretations of Toynbee's work and the film 2001. Marasco believed that the movie contained hidden philosophical messages about humanity's destiny and the possibility of resurrection through advanced technology. According to some researchers, Marasco may have been the person responsible for creating the tiles. However, the evidence remains incomplete. No one was ever definitively caught placing them in the streets. And the tiles appeared in cities far beyond Philadelphia, including locations as distant as South America. That raises another question. How were they installed? The method seems deceptively simple. Most Toynbee tiles appear to be made from pieces of linoleum arranged inside a protective backing, sometimes covered with tar paper. The entire piece would then be placed into a city street during warm weather when the asphalt softened slightly. Passing vehicles would gradually press the tile deeper into the road until it became permanently embedded. This technique allowed someone to place a tile quickly without needing heavy equipment. But installing them across multiple cities would still require travel and careful timing. Some researchers believe that more than one person may have been involved. Others suspect a single individual with an unusual dedication to spreading the message. What makes the mystery particularly fascinating is how persistent the tiles have been. City maintenance crews often remove them during road repairs. Asphalt is resurfaced, streets are repaved, and old pavement disappears beneath new layers. Yet new Toynbee tiles continued appearing for decades, sometimes with slightly different wording, sometimes in entirely new cities. The messages themselves rarely changed in their core theme, always referencing Toynbee, always referencing the idea of resurrection, always pointing somehow toward Jupiter. For many people who discover them, the tiles feel like fragments of a puzzle whose larger meaning remains hidden, not because they contain advanced technology or lost knowledge, but because the motivation behind them remains unclear. Why would someone dedicate years, perhaps decades, to placing cryptic philosophical messages into the pavement of busy streets? Was it meant as a kind of public art, a personal statement, or simply an idea that its creator believed deserved to be seen by the world, one intersection at a time? Today, some Toynbee tiles are preserved as curiosities of urban culture. Photographs circulate online, documenting the locations where they once appeared before roadwork erased them. Others remain quietly embedded in asphalt, slowly fading as cars drive over them day after day. They are easy to miss, but once you notice one, you begin to look for them everywhere. Small rectangles hidden in plain sight, carrying a message that has been traveling through city streets for more than 40 years. A message about history, space, and resurrection, pressed permanently into the road beneath our feet. The Utsuro Bune, the strange boat of 1803. In the early years of the 19th century, along the eastern coast of Japan, fishermen and villagers occasionally reported unusual things drifting ashore. Wrecked fishing vessels, foreign ships carried by storms, or sometimes objects whose origins were not immediately clear. Japan at that time was living under the policy of Sakoku, a period of strict national isolation imposed by the Tokugawa shogunate. Foreign contact was tightly controlled, and most Japanese citizens had never seen people or technologies from outside their own culture, which made the events reported in 1803 particularly unusual. According to several historical documents from the Edo period, villagers along the coast of Hitachi province witnessed the arrival of a strange vessel drifting toward the shore. The craft was unlike any boat they had seen before. It appeared rounded, almost circular, with a flat bottom and a domed upper section. Some accounts describe the top portion as being fitted with small windows made of glass or crystal-like material. The lower half of the vessel was said to be reinforced with metal plates. When the boat washed ashore, villagers gathered around it cautiously. Inside, they reportedly found a young woman sitting quietly among unfamiliar objects. The woman's appearance puzzled the onlookers. Her hair was described as reddish or light-colored, which was unusual in Japan at the time. Her clothing was made from fabrics that local people did not recognize, and the patterns sewn into the material seemed completely unfamiliar. Perhaps most mysterious of all, the woman carried a small box that she guarded carefully. Whenever anyone tried to examine the box, she held it tightly and refused to let it go. Communication proved impossible. The villagers attempted to speak with her, but she appeared not to understand their language. Her own speech, according to the reports, sounded unfamiliar. Not Chinese, not Dutch, and not any language that local interpreters could identify. Inside the vessel, strange symbols were reportedly inscribed along the walls. Some witnesses described them as geometric characters or unfamiliar writing systems. None of the villagers could read them. The event was eventually recorded in several Edo period manuscripts, including collections of strange stories and regional chronicles that documented unusual incidents. Among these were texts such as Toen Shosetsu and Ume no Chiri, which included illustrations of the vessel and descriptions of the encounter. These drawings show a rounded craft with window panels and intricate markings, as well as the mysterious woman seated inside. Over time, the story became known as the legend of the Utsuro Bune. The phrase literally means hollow boat. But what exactly had washed ashore that day? One possibility is that the story reflects a misunderstanding involving a foreign shipwreck survivor. Although Japan was officially closed to most outside contact during the Edo period, ships from other regions occasionally drifted into Japanese waters by accident. Russian traders, European sailors, and other travelers sometimes appeared unexpectedly along remote coastlines. A survivor from a damaged vessel might easily have seemed mysterious to villagers unfamiliar with foreign clothing or language. The unusual shape of the boat described in the story could also have been exaggerated or misunderstood over time. Another explanation involves folklore. Many Edo period manuscripts collected strange or supernatural stories alongside historical events. Tales of mysterious travelers, ghost ships, and unknown visitors were popular forms of storytelling. The Utsuro Bune narrative may have been part historical report and part imaginative embellishment. In some versions of the story, villagers decide that the woman must come from another country and fear that allowing her to remain might attract trouble from authorities. So they return her to the sea. The strange vessel is pushed back into the water and allowed to drift away. If that ending reflects an actual event, it would mean that the mystery simply continued beyond the shoreline. No one knows where the vessel ultimately traveled. In modern times, the story has attracted renewed attention, especially among researchers interested in historical mysteries and unusual folklore. Some enthusiasts have even suggested that the description of the vessel resembles modern interpretations of unidentified flying objects. But historians tend to approach the story more cautiously. The manuscripts describing the event were written decades after the supposed encounter, and their purpose was often to record curious or entertaining stories rather than strictly verified historical reports. Even so, the persistence of the Utsurobune narrative reveals something fascinating about life in isolated Japan during the early 19th century. When unfamiliar objects appeared from the sea, they carried enormous mystery. A foreign traveler, a strange craft, unrecognizable language. In a society where most people had never encountered outsiders, such events could easily take on an almost mythical quality. Today, the story of the hollow boat remains part of Japan's long tradition of strange historical accounts, somewhere between folklore, maritime history, and mystery. The illustrations preserved in Edo period manuscripts continue to show that unusual vessel drifting toward shore, and inside it, a silent traveler holding tightly to a small box that no one was ever allowed to open. The Green Children of Banjos. In many parts of medieval Europe, unusual stories were recorded by chroniclers who attempted to document strange events taking place in the villages and countryside around them. Some accounts described celestial omens or mysterious travelers. Others recorded encounters so strange that they have continued to puzzle readers for centuries. One such story tells of two children who appeared suddenly near a rural village, children whose skin had an unusual green color and whose language no one could understand. The version we are exploring today is often associated with rural communities in medieval Spain, where a variation of the legend became known as the story of the Green Children of Banjos. According to the tale, villagers working in the fields one day discovered two young children wandering near the edge of farmland. The children appeared frightened and confused, as though they had become separated from their home. At first glance, they seemed ordinary enough. They were dressed in simple clothing and appeared to be around the age of 8 or 9, but something about them immediately caught the villagers' attention. Their skin had a faint green tint, not bright green like paint or fabric, but pale and sickly, almost as if their complexion had been stained by some unknown illness. When the villagers tried to speak with them, the children responded in a language that none of the local people recognized. The sounds they made did not resemble Spanish or any of the nearby regional dialects. Communication proved impossible. The children were taken into the care of villagers, who tried to provide food and shelter while attempting to understand where they had come from. But another strange detail soon appeared. The children refused most of the food offered to them. Bread, meat, fruit, everything was rejected. Instead, they seemed to recognize only one type of food: beans. When given raw beans still inside their pods, the children eagerly ate them, as if it were the only thing they recognized. Over time, the story claims that the children slowly began to adapt to village life. Their skin gradually lost its green color as their diet changed, and eventually one of the children, usually described as the girl, began to learn the local language. According to the legend, she eventually explained where they had come from. She described a place where the sun never shone brightly, a land of dim light, a place where everything had a greenish glow. The children, she said, had been tending livestock in their homeland when they heard a loud sound and suddenly found themselves in a tunnel or cavern. When they emerged, they were no longer in the place they knew. Instead, they had arrived in the world of the villagers. Stories like this spread widely in medieval Europe, and versions of the Green Children legend appear in several historical texts. One of the most famous accounts was written in the 12th century by chroniclers describing a similar event in England. But folklore often evolves as it travels, and regional variations appeared across different parts of Europe. The Spanish version associated with banjos follows many of the same themes: mysterious origin, strange language, unusual skin color, and a gradual adaptation to village life. Over time, people began offering explanations. Some suggested that the children might have been travelers from a distant region whose appearance and language were unfamiliar to local villagers. Others believed the green color of their skin might have been caused by illness or malnutrition. One modern theory points to a condition known as chlorosis, historically called green sickness, which could cause pale greenish skin tones in individuals suffering from severe nutritional deficiencies. Another possibility is that the story reflects a misunderstanding involving displaced children from migrant communities. In medieval Europe, people fleeing famine or conflict sometimes traveled long distances, arriving in unfamiliar regions where language barriers made communication extremely difficult. Children separated from their families could easily have seemed mysterious to villagers encountering them for the first time. Still, the legend continued to grow. Some storytellers suggested the children had come from underground realms. Others imagined they had arrived from another world entirely. These interpretations reveal how medieval societies often explained unfamiliar events through myth and imagination. When something appeared that did not fit existing knowledge, people filled the gaps with stories. Today, the Green Children legend remains part of European folklore, a curious blend of history, misunderstanding, and storytelling. Whether the children described in the tale were real individuals or characters shaped by centuries of retelling is difficult to determine, but the story itself captures something timeless about human curiosity. Two children appearing from nowhere, speaking a language no one understands, carrying with them a glimpse of a world that seems just slightly different from our own, and then slowly becoming part of the village where they were found. The Fresno Nightcrawler. Late at night in quiet neighborhoods, security cameras often record things that no one expects to see. Most of the time, the footage is ordinary: a passing car, a wandering cat, a branch moving in the wind. But every once in a while, something appears that seems completely unfamiliar. That is exactly what happened in 2007 in the city of Fresno, California. A homeowner had installed a small security camera outside his house to monitor the yard during the night. The system recorded continuously, capturing the hours of empty footage as the quiet streets of the neighborhood slept. But one night, the camera recorded something unusual moving across the lawn. When the homeowner later reviewed the video, he noticed a small white shape walking slowly through the frame. At first glance, it looked almost like a pair of legs. There was no visible upper body, no arms, just two long white forms stepping carefully across the grass, moving with a slow and deliberate motion before disappearing into the darkness beyond the camera's view. The movement was strangely smooth. Each step seemed balanced and controlled, as though the figure was walking upright on two legs. Yet there was no torso visible above them. When the footage was shared online, it quickly caught the attention of viewers who were unsure what they were looking at. Some people suggested it might be a person wearing unusual clothing. Others wondered whether it could be a puppet or a hoax created for entertainment. But many viewers found the movement unsettling, because whatever the object was, it appeared to walk with a rhythm that looked almost natural. The figure soon became known as the Fresno Nightcrawler. The name came simply from the location of the sighting and the creature's strange walking motion. Researchers interested in unexplained phenomena examined the footage carefully. Frame-by-frame analysis showed the figure entering the camera's field of view, taking several slow steps and leaving the scene without any sign of manipulation or obvious editing. Still, the quality of the video was low. The camera had been designed for basic security monitoring, not detailed imaging. The shape of the figure was blurred, and the distance from the camera made it difficult to determine scale. It could have been small, or larger than it appeared. Then, a few years later, another video surfaced. This time the recording came from a security camera near Yosemite National Park, several hundred kilometers north of Fresno. The footage appeared to show a similar figure, a white shape with two long legs walking across an open area at night. The resemblance to the original video was striking. Once again, the figure moved slowly and steadily, stepping forward with an unusual but consistent gait before vanishing into darkness. With two videos showing similar figures, the mystery deepened. Some viewers began suggesting that the Fresno Nightcrawler might represent an unknown animal or creature. Others pointed to Native American folklore, noting that certain legends from tribes in California describe tall, white, spirit-like beings associated with the land. However, folklorists caution that such interpretations can easily be influenced by modern storytelling rather than traditional accounts. More grounded explanations have also been proposed. One possibility is that the figure could be a person wearing loose fabric or a costume designed to conceal the upper body. Another suggestion is that the movement might belong to an animal captured from an unusual angle, with its body hidden by lighting or shadows. Video analysts have also considered the possibility of a puppet or mechanical device placed within view of the camera. Yet none of these explanations has been definitively confirmed. The original homeowner who recorded the Fresno footage maintained that he had no idea what the figure was and denied staging the event. The recording simply appeared during routine review of the security tapes. Since then, the Fresno Nightcrawler has become one of the more unusual entries in the world of modern urban mysteries. Unlike many legends, it does not come from centuries-old folklore or ancient manuscripts. Instead, it comes from something very contemporary, a security camera. a few seconds of video recorded quietly in the middle of the night. Today, the footage continues to circulate online, analyzed and debated by viewers who try to determine exactly what appears in those brief frames. Some see nothing more than a trick of lighting and motion. Others see something stranger. But the video itself remains simple. A quiet yard, a fixed camera watching the darkness, and for a few moments a pale shape stepping carefully across the ground before disappearing again into the night. The Maori Man Geoglyph. In the remote deserts of South Australia, where vast stretches of red earth extend toward the horizon and human settlements are separated by hundreds of kilometers, an enormous figure appeared on the landscape almost overnight. It was not carved into stone. It was not built from monuments. Instead, the image had been etched directly into the desert floor. The year was 1998, and the figure would soon become known as the Maori Man. The discovery was made near the small, outback town of Maori, a community that sits at the edge of one of the most sparsely populated regions on Earth. The surrounding land is dry, open, and vast, with long stretches of flat terrain that reveal their secrets only from the air, which is exactly how the figure was first noticed. A pilot flying over the area reported seeing a massive outline carved into the desert surface. From the air, the design clearly resembled a human figure holding what appeared to be a throwing stick or spear. The lines forming the image were enormous. In fact, the entire geoglyph stretched nearly 4 kilometers from head to foot. That makes it one of the largest pieces of ground art ever discovered. The lines themselves were created by scraping away the darker surface stones that normally cover the desert floor. Beneath those stones lies a lighter colored layer of soil, and when the surface rocks are moved aside, the contrast becomes visible from above. By clearing the stones along carefully planned paths, someone had drawn the giant figure directly onto the desert landscape. From the ground, however, the design was almost impossible to recognize. Standing beside one of the lines, a person might see only a shallow trench in the dirt, perhaps 30 centimeters deep and several meters wide. Only from high above did the full image appear, a tall human figure with one arm extended, holding what looked like a traditional hunting tool. The style of the figure immediately reminded many observers of ancient geoglyphs, such as the famous Nazca lines of Peru. But there was a key difference. The Nazca lines were created thousands of years ago. The Maori Man had appeared suddenly in modern times. No one in the nearby towns had seen anyone creating the enormous drawing. Yet the scale of the work suggested that heavy equipment must have been used. Investigators later determined that the trenches forming the image were likely carved using a grader or bulldozer, guided by satellite navigation or aerial reference points. The precision of the lines indicated careful planning. Whoever created the figure had clearly intended it to be visible primarily from the sky. Soon after the discovery, anonymous messages began arriving at media outlets in Australia. These messages appeared to claim responsibility for the geoglyph, though none provided verifiable identity. One fax sent to newspapers contained references to Aboriginal culture and included a small Serase American flag, along with a quote about the desert. Other clues appeared in unusual places. A plaque referencing the geoglyph was briefly found in a hotel room in the nearby town of Maori. The plaque included a map of the figure and a quotation about the Australian desert, but it offered no clear explanation for who had created the massive artwork. Because the figure appeared to resemble an indigenous Australian hunter, some people wondered whether the geoglyph might be connected to Aboriginal traditions. However, many Aboriginal community members expressed concern about the drawing, noting that it had been created without consultation and did not correspond to known cultural practices in the region. For them, the desert landscape holds deep spiritual and historical significance, and the sudden appearance of such a massive image raised questions about respect for traditional lands. Despite various investigations, the creator of the Maori Man has never been conclusively identified. Several theories have been proposed. Some believe the geoglyph may have been created by an artist interested in large-scale land art. Others suspect a group of individuals working together with access to surveying equipment and heavy machinery. One widely discussed possibility involves a group of artists and engineers who had previously experimented with large desert drawings elsewhere in the world, but no definitive evidence has ever surfaced. Over time, wind and weather began to soften the edges of the trenches. The desert slowly reclaimed the lines and the figure became harder to see from the air. Yet the mystery did not end there. In 2016, local tourism groups collaborated with authorities to restore the geoglyph using GPS-guided grading equipment. The lines were carefully refreshed, bringing the Mari man back into view once again. Today, the enormous figure still lies across the desert near Mari, visible primarily from aircraft and satellite imagery. It remains one of the largest geoglyphs ever created in modern times. And despite the passage of more than 2 decades, the identity of the person, or people, responsible for carving it into the Australian landscape remains unknown. In a place where the horizon stretches endlessly across red earth and sky, the giant figure continues to stand silently in the desert. A modern mystery written directly onto the land itself. The dancing plague of 1518. In the summer of 1518, something very strange began to happen in the city of Strasbourg. At first, it involved only one person. A woman stepped into the street and began to dance. But this was not celebration, music, or festival. According to contemporary accounts, the woman continued dancing for hours without stopping. When exhaustion forced her to rest, she soon rose again and continued moving, as if compelled by something she could not control. Her name was Frau Trophia, and within days others began to follow. One by one, more people joined her in the streets of Strasbourg, dancing in a strange, relentless rhythm. Some accounts say the movement looked frantic, almost desperate. Others describe it as mechanical, repetitive, and completely detached from any music or celebration. Within a week, dozens of people were dancing. Within a month, hundreds. The city authorities were baffled. Strasbourg in the early 16th century was a busy trading center along the Rhine River, part of the Holy Roman Empire and home to thousands of residents. But nothing like this had ever been recorded before. People were dancing until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some reportedly danced for days at a time. Witnesses described individuals staggering through the streets, sweating heavily, sometimes crying out in distress while their bodies continued moving. And in some tragic cases, the dancing did not end until the person collapsed completely. At first, local officials attempted to treat the situation in a way that might seem surprising today. They believed that the afflicted people simply needed to release the strange energy building inside them. So instead of stopping the dancing, authorities encouraged it. They cleared sections of the city square. Musicians were hired. Even temporary wooden stages were built so the dancers could continue their movements safely. But the strategy did not help. In fact, it seemed to make the phenomenon worse. More people began dancing. Some medical authorities of the time believed the condition might be caused by hot blood, a concept rooted in medieval theories of bodily humors. According to this idea, excessive heat in the blood could produce uncontrollable physical reactions. Others suspected supernatural causes. In the religious culture of the time, sudden, unexplained behavior was sometimes interpreted as punishment from divine forces or the influence of spirits. One widely circulated explanation blamed the wrath of Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr whose name had long been associated with certain neurological conditions. According to this belief, those who angered the saint might be cursed with uncontrollable dancing. Eventually, the city leaders changed their approach. Instead of encouraging the dancers, they arranged for many of them to be transported to a nearby shrine, dedicated to Saint Vitus. There, priests conducted rituals and prayers intended to remove the supposed curse. Gradually, the dancing began to stop. By early autumn, the strange outbreak had faded away. But the question remained. What had actually happened in Strasbourg in 1518? Modern historians and medical researchers have examined the historical records carefully, trying to understand the event through the lens of psychology and social behavior. One leading explanation involves what is known as mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon in which groups of people begin experiencing similar symptoms without a clear physical cause. Such events often occur during periods of intense stress or hardship, and the early 16th century was a difficult time in the region around Strasbourg. Harvest failures, famine, disease, and economic instability had created enormous pressure within the population. People lived with constant uncertainty, and daily survival could be difficult. Under such conditions, psychological stress can sometimes manifest in physical ways. When one person begins exhibiting unusual behavior, others may unconsciously follow, especially in tightly connected communities where fear and anxiety spread quickly. In this sense, the dancing plague may represent a form of collective, psychological response to extreme social pressure. Yet the descriptions from the time remain unsettling. People dancing for hours, for days, until exhaustion forced them to collapse. The streets filled with bodies moving in a strange rhythm no one could explain. Today, the story of the dancing plague of 1518 stands as one of the most unusual episodes in European history, not because it involved monsters or supernatural forces, but because it shows how deeply human behavior can be shaped by the pressures of the world around us. In the crowded streets of Strasbourg more than 500 years ago, something spread through the population that no one could see. And for a brief moment in history, an entire city seemed to move to a rhythm that no one could control. The legends of Devil's Tower. Rising dramatically from the rolling plains of northeastern Wyoming is a towering rock formation that seems almost impossible to ignore. From miles away, the structure dominates the landscape, a massive column of stone rising nearly 400 meters above the surrounding terrain. Its steep sides are marked by long vertical grooves that run from the base to the summit, giving the formation the appearance of an enormous carved pillar. Today, the site is known as Devil's Tower National Monument. But long before the area became a national monument, the tower held deep meaning for many indigenous nations who lived throughout the surrounding plains and mountains. For them, this striking formation was not simply a geological feature. It was part of living history. According to several Native American traditions, the tower was formed during a dramatic event involving powerful natural forces and spiritual beings. One of the most widely shared of legends comes from the Lakota people. In this story, a group of children were playing in the forest when they were suddenly chased by enormous bears. The animals pursued the children across the land, closing in quickly. With no way to escape, the children climbed onto a small rock and prayed for help. The ground beneath them began to rise. The rock grew taller and taller, lifting the children high into the sky, where the bears could no longer reach them. The bears clawed at the sides of the rising stone, trying to climb after them. Their claws scraped deep grooves into the rock, but the tower continued rising until the children were safe above the animals. Eventually, according to the legend, the children were transformed into stars and placed in the sky. And the marks left by the bear's claws remained on the sides of the tower. Even today, visitors can see the long vertical grooves that run down the surface of the rock. To many observers, the lines do resemble enormous claw marks carved into the stone, but geology tells a different story about how the tower formed. Devil's Tower is made primarily of igneous rock, magma that cooled and solidified deep underground millions of years ago. As the molten material slowly cooled, it contracted and cracked, forming the tall polygonal columns visible along the tower's surface. These columns are known as columnar joints, and similar structures can be seen in volcanic formations around the world. Over time, erosion removed the surrounding sedimentary rock that once covered the formation, gradually exposing the tower itself. What remains today is the hardened core of an ancient geological process, a column of solid rock that once lay hidden beneath layers of earth. As those layers eroded away, the tower emerged, rising alone above the plains. But for many indigenous cultures, the geological explanation does not replace the traditional stories. Instead, both perspectives exist side by side. The legends reflect the deep relationship between people and the land, offering symbolic explanations that connect natural features to cultural memory and spiritual meaning. Across the northern plains, tribes including the Lakota, Cheyenne, Kiowa, Arapaho, and Crow have their own versions of the tower's story. Each narrative differs slightly, but many involve children, bears, and a miraculous transformation of the landscape. Some versions describe the tower rising suddenly from the earth. Others speak of giant animals leaving their marks upon the stone. In each telling, the formation is more than just rock. It is a place where the natural world and human experience intersect. When European explorers reached the region during the 19th century, they were equally struck by the tower's unusual shape. In 1875, an expedition led by Colonel Richard Irving Dodge recorded the formation and gave it the name Devil's Tower, a title that has remained ever since. However, many indigenous groups prefer alternative names that reflect the site's original cultural significance. Names such as Bear Lodge or Bear's Teepee are often used to honor the traditional stories associated with the tower. Today, the monument attracts climbers, hikers, and travelers from around the world. From the ground, the tower's vertical columns appear enormous, each one several meters across. Looking up from the base, the summit seems almost impossibly high. Yet the formation itself is only one part of a much older landscape. The surrounding plains once supported vast herds of bison, and the nearby Black Hills region has long been considered sacred territory by several Native American nations. For many visitors, the experience of standing beneath the tower is powerful, not only because of its geological uniqueness, but because of the stories connected to it. Stories passed down through generations. Stories explaining how a group of children escaped enormous bears, stories about claw marks carved into stone, and stories reminding us that landscapes often carry meaning far beyond what we see in the rock itself. Devil's Tower remains one of the most recognizable natural landmarks in North America, a solitary column rising from the plains, and a place where legend and geology stand together beneath the wide Wyoming sky. The Betts Sphere. In the spring of 1974, a quiet discovery on a piece of land in Florida would soon attract national attention and spark one of the strangest modern mysteries in American folklore. The story began near the city of Jacksonville, Florida, where a family named Betts owned a wooded property outside the city. The land was largely undeveloped, filled with trees, brush, and open ground where the family occasionally explored. One day, while walking across the property, the Betts family noticed something unusual resting on the ground. It was a metal sphere. The object was smooth, perfectly round, and about the size of a bowling ball. When they picked it up, they noticed that it was surprisingly heavy for its size, weighing roughly 10 kilograms. At first, it looked like an ordinary piece of industrial metal. There were no seams visible along the surface, no clear markings, and no obvious indication of where it had come from. The steel-like exterior reflected light softly, giving the sphere a polished appearance despite being found outdoors. The Betts family decided to take the object home. What happened next is what made the story famous. According to the family, the sphere did not behave like a normal metal ball. When placed on the floor or a table, it sometimes appeared to roll on its own, changing direction unexpectedly, or returning toward the person who had pushed it away. At times, they claimed the sphere would vibrate slightly when exposed to certain sounds, particularly music. In one account, the family reported that when a guitar was played nearby, the sphere responded with faint humming tones, almost as if the metal surface were resonating with the sound waves. These unusual behaviors quickly attracted curiosity. Friends who visited the house tried experimenting with the sphere. Some rolled it across the floor, while others placed it on surfaces to observe whether it moved without assistance. The stories began spreading through local newspapers. Soon, journalists were visiting the Betts' home to see the object for themselves. Photographs of the sphere appeared in news articles across the United States, and speculation about its origin grew rapidly. Some people believed the object might be part of an experimental machine or a piece of military equipment that had somehow been lost in the woods. Others suggested it might be a fragment of space hardware, perhaps debris from a satellite, a rocket that had fallen to Earth, and of course, some speculated about more mysterious possibilities. A strange metal sphere that rolled on its own, a humming response to sound. The story quickly captured the imagination of the public. Eventually, the Betts family allowed the sphere to be examined by researchers. Engineers and scientists from several organizations conducted tests to determine its composition and structure. The results were far less mysterious than many people had expected. The sphere appeared to be made to be primarily of stainless steel. X-ray imaging showed that the object was hollow, containing smaller metal structures inside. These internal components suggested that the sphere had been manufactured for a specific industrial purpose, rather than forming naturally. Researchers concluded that the object was likely part of a large industrial valve system, possibly a ball check valve used in pipelines or heavy machinery. These valves contain metal spheres that move inside mechanical chambers to regulate the flow of liquids or gases. Over time, such components can become separated from their original equipment and end up in unexpected places. As for the sphere's unusual movement, investigators suggested several simple explanations. A perfectly round steel ball placed on a slightly uneven surface can roll unpredictably. Small vibrations in the floor, caused by footsteps, air movement, or nearby traffic, might also influence its motion, and the humming sound reported by the family could easily be explained by acoustic resonance, a phenomenon in which hollow metal objects vibrate in response to nearby sound frequencies. Despite these explanations, the Betts sphere continued to fascinate the public. Part of the reason lies in how the story developed. A mysterious object discovered in the woods, unusual movements observed inside a home, newspapers spreading the story across the country. In an era before the internet, such mysteries traveled slowly through radio broadcasts, printed photographs, and word of mouth. Each retelling added another layer of curiosity. Even today, the Betts sphere remains a well-known example of how ordinary objects can become extraordinary when their origins are unclear. The metal ball itself eventually disappeared from public attention, passing into private ownership and fading from the spotlight. But the story still circulates. A simple steel sphere found in the Florida woods, an object that seemed to move on its own, and a reminder that sometimes the most puzzling discoveries begin with something as small and as simple as a ball of metal lying quietly on the ground. The Devil's Kettle Waterfall. Deep in the forests of northern Minnesota, not far from the cold waters of Lake Superior, a river flows through a landscape shaped by glaciers, stone, and time. This is the Brule River, a rugged northern waterway that cuts through dense pine forests and ancient volcanic rock as it makes its way toward the lake. For most of its journey, the river behaves exactly as you would expect, flowing over rocks, winding through valleys, and forming small waterfalls along its path. But at one particular location inside Judge C.R. Magny State Park, something very unusual happens. The river splits in two. One half of the water continues downstream normally, tumbling over a rocky ledge and continuing its course through the forest. The other half disappears. It pours directly into a deep circular hole carved into the bedrock, a dark opening known as the Devil's Kettle. For decades, no one knew where that water went. Standing beside the falls, visitors can watch the river divide. The left side forms a traditional waterfall, spilling down a rocky drop and flowing onward through the canyon. But the right side vanishes into the kettle. The water rushes downward into the hole and disappears completely from sight. There is no visible outlet, no second waterfall, no stream emerging from the hillside below, just a swirling dark opening where half the river seems to vanish underground. Naturally, this strange feature captured the imagination of everyone who saw it: geologists, park rangers, visitors, and for many years no one could offer a clear explanation. Early explorers of the region noticed the waterfall long before the area became a protected park. The surrounding land was rugged and remote, and the unusual split in the river quickly became a subject of local curiosity. People began wondering what lay beneath the kettle. Did the water travel through underground tunnels? Did it connect to hidden caverns deep below the forest? Or could it somehow flow all the way to Lake Superior through unseen channels beneath the rock? To investigate the mystery, researchers began conducting informal experiments. Park visitors threw objects into the kettle to see where they might emerge: sticks, ping pong balls, even colored dye. None of them were ever seen again. The objects simply vanished into the hole along with the rushing water. Because of this, some people speculated that the kettle might connect to an underground cave system large enough to carry the water far away from the visible river. But there was a problem with that idea. The geology of the area does not easily support large cave networks. The rock surrounding the Brule River is primarily rhyolite, a dense volcanic rock that does not dissolve easily in water. Unlike limestone regions, where underground caverns often form, rhyolite tends to remain solid and resistant to erosion, which meant that if the water really was traveling underground, it would need some other path through the rock. For many years, the mystery remained unsolved. Then, in the early 21st century, geologists began approaching the question with more precise tools. Instead of relying on floating objects, researchers carefully measured the amount of water flowing into the waterfall and compared it with the amount flowing out downstream. If half the river truly disappeared underground, the flow rate below the falls would be dramatically smaller. But when scientists conducted detailed measurements, they discovered something surprising. The volume of water entering the falls was almost exactly the same as the volume leaving them. In other words, the water that vanished into the kettle was still part of the river. It had not disappeared at all. The conclusion suggested that the water inside the Devil's Kettle simply rejoins the river somewhere below the waterfall, likely through narrow channels hidden within the fractured volcanic rock. These passages are not large caves. Instead, they are small cracks and gaps within the stone, pathways carved slowly by water over thousands of years. Because the river flows through a steep gorge, those hidden channels allow the kettle's water to re-enter the mainstream further downstream, out of sight of observers standing above the falls. From the surface, it looks as though the water has vanished, but in reality, it is simply taking a hidden route through the rock before returning to the river. Even with this explanation, the Devil's Kettle remains a remarkable natural feature. Few waterfalls on Earth split in such a dramatic way, sending part of their flow directly into a dark hole in the rock, and even fewer managed to remain mysterious for so long. For decades, people stood beside the falls watching half a river disappear, listening to the roar of water echoing inside the kettle, wondering where it might lead. Today, the waterfall continues to attract hikers and travelers exploring Minnesota's North Shore. A forest trail winds through tall pines before arriving at the overlook where the Brule River divides. Visitors lean over the railing, watching the water surge toward the split. One branch flowing forward, the other vanishing downward into the darkness. And even though science now offers a likely explanation, the moment still feels strange. Because watching a river disappear into the earth triggers a very old kind of curiosity. The same curiosity that has drawn people to unusual landscapes for thousands of years. Where does it go? What lies beneath? And how many other hidden paths might exist beneath the surface of the world we see every day? The Phantom Barber of Pascagoula. In the summer of 1942, during the tense early years of World War II, residents of a quiet town on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi began reporting something deeply unsettling. People were waking up in the middle of the night to discover that someone had entered their homes and cut off small portions of their hair. The incidents occurred in the town of Pascagoula, Mississippi, a coastal community where shipyards and wartime industries were rapidly expanding as the United States mobilized for the global conflict. Despite the serious events unfolding overseas, it was this strange local mystery that soon captured the town's attention. The first reports began quietly. Several residents told local police that they had woken during the night to find locks of their hair missing. In most cases, the victims had been asleep in their own beds, and there were no signs of forced entry into the homes. The cuts were usually small, just a few strands or a small section trimmed from the back of the head. but the fact that someone might be entering houses unnoticed while people slept was enough to alarm the community. Soon more cases appeared. A teenage girl reported waking up to find that part of her hair had been cut during the night. Another resident discovered hair missing from his head after hearing faint noises but seeing no one inside the house. Within days, newspapers began referring to the mysterious intruder as the Phantom Barber. The name quickly spread, and with it came growing fear. Police launched an investigation, interviewing residents and searching for any clues that might identify the person responsible. Officers patrolled neighborhoods at night and questioned individuals who might have had access to the homes. But the evidence was almost non-existent. No witnesses had clearly seen the intruder. No footprints or tools were discovered, and the haircuts themselves were often uneven, as though performed quickly. In darkness, rumors began circulating throughout Pascagoula. Some residents believed the incidents might be connected to wartime sabotage or espionage. During World War II, coastal towns were on high alert for unusual activity, and fears of spies or enemy agents were common. Others believed the barber might simply be a prankster, someone sneaking into homes for the thrill of causing panic. But the situation grew stranger when investigators began noticing a pattern. In many cases, the victims had been sleeping near open windows or doors on warm summer nights. The houses were not always locked, and the cuts of hair were often small enough that the victims did not wake until morning. This led some officers to wonder whether the events might have been exaggerated or misunderstood. Still, the tension in town continued to build. At one point, local police arrested a suspect, a man who reportedly carried scissors and had been seen wandering the streets late at night. The arrest briefly reassured residents that the mystery might be solved. But investigators soon discovered that the evidence against him was weak. The man was released, and the incidents gradually stopped. No one was ever officially charged with the crimes. No clear explanation was ever confirmed. As the months passed and the United States became increasingly focused on the war effort, attention slowly shifted away from the strange events in Pascagoula. Shipyards expanded. Factories increased production. Young men left town to join the military. The mystery of the Phantom Barber faded quietly into local memory. Today, historians looking back on the story often consider several possible explanations. One possibility is that a prankster or local troublemaker carried out the haircutting incidents, taking advantage of unlocked houses and sleeping residents during the hot summer months. Another theory suggests that the events may have been exaggerated through rumor, with a few small incidents becoming amplified as stories spread from neighbor to neighbor. Psychologists sometimes point to the atmosphere of wartime anxiety as a factor. During periods of stress and uncertainty, communities can become more sensitive to unusual events, interpreting ordinary occurrences as something more threatening. In that sense, the Phantom Barber might represent a mixture of real incidents and growing collective fear. But because no definitive evidence was ever discovered, the mystery remains unresolved. What is known is that during one unusual summer in 1942, the residents of Pascagoula went to sleep wondering whether someone might quietly enter their homes in the middle of the night, not to steal, not to harm, but simply to cut a lock of hair before disappearing again into the darkness. The precision stones of Pumapunku. High in the Andes Mountains of western Bolivia, more than 3,800 meters above sea level, lies one of the most unusual archaeological sites in South America. The region is vast and windswept, surrounded by dry plains and distant mountains. Nearby sits the famous ancient city of Tiwanaku, once the center of a powerful civilization that flourished long before the rise of the Inca Empire. Just beside that ancient city is a structure known as Pumapunku. At first glance, the site looks like a massive field of scattered stone blocks. Huge pieces of reddish sandstone and gray andesite lie across the ground as if an enormous building had once stood here and later collapsed. But when researchers began studying the stones more carefully, they noticed something remarkable. Many of the blocks had been shaped with extraordinary precision. Some stones feature perfectly straight edges that meet at sharp right angles. Others contain smooth drilled holes placed at consistent intervals along their surfaces. And perhaps most striking are the famous H-shaped blocks, large andesite stones carved with geometric cutouts that appear almost machine-made. The edges are crisp, the angles are exact, and the surfaces are unusually smooth. For a long time, these details puzzled early archaeologists. Pumapunku is believed to have been built more than 1,000 years ago by the people of the Tiwanaku civilization, which reached its peak between about 500 and 1000 CE. At that time, this region of the Andes supported a thriving society known for agriculture, trade, and monumental architecture. Yet the tools available to the builders were relatively simple. There is no evidence that the Tiwanaku people used iron or steel tools. Instead, they worked primarily with stone tools, copper implements, and abrasive materials such as sand. So how were the stones at Pumapunku shaped with such precision? Some blocks weigh more than 100 tons. Others were carved from extremely hard andesite, a volcanic rock that can be difficult to cut even with modern tools. These challenges led some observers to speculate that the stones must have been shaped using advanced technologies unknown to ancient civilizations. But archaeological research offers a different perspective. Studies of the stone surfaces show subtle marks consistent with grinding and abrasion, rather than mechanical drilling. By repeatedly rubbing harder stones and sand against the surface, ancient builders could slowly shape and polish even very hard rock. This process required patience rather than machinery. It also required organization. The builders of Pumapunku appear to have carefully planned the shapes of the blocks so they could fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Some stones contained notches and grooves that allowed them to connect using metal clamps. In fact, archaeologists have discovered traces of copper alloy clamps that once held the stones together. These clamps were poured into small channels carved between blocks, creating a kind of early structural fastening system. The famous H-shaped blocks may have been part of a larger architectural design, possibly forming walls, platforms, or ceremonial structures within the complex. When the structures eventually collapsed, the blocks scattered across the site, leaving behind the unusual arrangement visible today. Another challenge faced by the builders was transportation. Some of the stones used at Pumapunku were quarried from locations several kilometers away, while the andesite blocks may have been transported from volcanic outcrops across Lake Titicaca. Moving such heavy stones without wheeled vehicles or draft animals required significant coordination. Researchers believe large teams of workers likely used wooden sledges, rollers, and ropes to drag the stones across prepared paths. Water channels and seasonal flooding may also have helped transport materials closer to the construction site. What makes Pumapunku especially impressive is the consistency of its stonework. Even though the tools were simple, the builders achieved a level of precision that required careful measurement and planning. Each block had to be shaped so that it aligned with neighboring stones. Edges had to meet cleanly. Angles had to remain consistent across multiple pieces. In other words, the precision of the stones reflects not advanced machines, but advanced craftsmanship. The Tiwanaku civilization itself remains somewhat mysterious, because it left no written language that researchers have been able to decipher. Most of what we know about the culture comes from archaeological remains, temples, plazas, agricultural terraces, and carefully carved monuments scattered across the high plateau. Pumapunku appears to have been one of the most important ceremonial structures within that landscape. Its name comes from the Aymara language and is often translated as the door of the Puma. Although the original buildings are long gone, the surviving stones still hint at a once massive architectural complex. Today, visitors walking among the blocks can run their hands along the smooth surfaces and sharp angles carved centuries ago. Looking closely, the craftsmanship becomes clear. Straight lines cut into volcanic stone, perfectly aligned corners, small holes drilled into surfaces that once held connecting clamps. The site reminds us that ancient engineering often relied not on machines, but on skill, patience, and deep knowledge of materials. And high in the Andes, where thin air and distant mountains surround the ruins of Tiwanaku, The stones of Pumapunku continue to tell the quiet story of a civilization that mastered the art of shaping rock with remarkable precision. The buried mystery of the Cockno Stone. Just outside the city of Glasgow, in a quiet field near the village of Clydebank, lies one of the most mysterious prehistoric carvings in Europe. But if you were to visit the site today, you would not see it, because the stone itself is buried. Hidden beneath layers of soil and grass, the Cockno Stone rests exactly where it has been for thousands of years, deliberately covered to protect it from damage and vandalism. Yet beneath that earth lies a remarkable piece of prehistoric art. The Cockno Stone is a massive sandstone slab measuring roughly 13 meters across and weighing many tons. Carved into its surface are hundreds of intricate patterns known as cup and ring marks, circular depressions surrounded by rings and connecting grooves etched into the rock. At first glance, the carvings look almost abstract. Concentric circles spread across the stone like ripples in water. Small cup-shaped indentations appear at the center of many rings, while lines extend outward, connecting different patterns together. The design covers nearly the entire surface of the stone. No one knows exactly what it means. Archaeologists believe the carvings were created during the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, possibly between 3000 and 2000 BCE. At that time, communities across parts of Britain and Ireland were creating similar rock carvings on exposed stone surfaces. These petroglyphs appear in remote hillsides, open fields, and rocky outcrops across the landscape. But the Cockno Stone is one of the largest and most detailed examples ever discovered. It was first documented in the late 19th century, when archaeologists studying ancient sites in Scotland noticed the unusual patterns carved into the sandstone surface. Early drawings and photographs recorded the full design before the stone became widely known. For many years, the rock remained exposed. Visitors could walk across the surface, tracing the circulars patterns with their fingers and trying to interpret the ancient markings. But that accessibility eventually created a problem. As the site became more widely known, people began carving their own initials and graffiti into the stone. Paint was sometimes applied to the carvings in attempts to make them more visible, which unintentionally damaged the original surface. Archaeologists became concerned that the ancient designs might eventually be lost. So in the 1960s, a decision was made. The Cockno Stone would be buried again. Covering the stone with soil would protect the carvings from weathering and vandalism, allowing future generations to study the site with better preservation techniques. For decades, the stone remained hidden beneath the earth. Then, in 2016, archaeologists briefly uncovered it again as part of a research project using modern mapping technology. The excavation allowed scientists to document the carvings in high resolution using laser scanning and digital imaging. For the first time, researchers were able to create detailed three-dimensional maps of the entire surface. The results revealed just how complex the design truly is. More than 90 individual carved features cover the stone, including dozens of cup and ring patterns, as well as long grooves and lines connecting different sections of the artwork. Some archaeologists believe these patterns may have held symbolic or ritual meaning for the communities that created them. Others suggest the carvings might represent territorial markers, ceremonial spaces, or even early attempts at mapping the surrounding landscape. There are also theories that the patterns could relate to astronomical observations, though evidence for this idea remains uncertain. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Cockno Stone is the presence of later markings added by 20th century researchers. In the 1930s, archaeologist Ludovic McClellan Mann drew chalk lines across the surface of the stone, creating a grid system to help document the positions of the carvings. He believed the patterns might represent a form of ancient astronomical chart, and the grid was intended to measure their alignment. Although his theory was never widely accepted, the grid markings themselves became part of the stone's modern history. When archaeologists uncovered the site again in 2016, the faint traces of Mann's chalk grid could still be seen across the surface. After the digital documentation was completed, the stone was carefully buried once again. Today, the Cockno stone remains hidden beneath the Scottish soil. Visitors walking across the quiet field above it would have no idea that beneath their feet lies one of the most complex prehistoric carvings ever discovered in Britain. And perhaps that is fitting. The people who carved the stone thousands of years ago left no written explanation of their work. The meaning of the circles, grooves, and patterns remains unknown, but the stone itself still exists, protected beneath the earth, waiting quietly for future archaeologists and future technologies to uncover its secrets once again. The Black Pyramid of Alaska. Deep within the vast wilderness of Alaska, where mountains stretch across the horizon and entire regions remain largely untouched by modern development, there exists a story that has circulated for decades among explorers, researchers, and enthusiasts of unexplained history. It is a story about a pyramid, not the kind built in ancient Egypt, not a visible monument rising above the landscape, but a massive structure said to lie hidden beneath the mountains of Alaska. According to the rumor, somewhere in the remote interior between Anchorage and the towering peak of Denali, formerly known as Mount McKinley, there is an enormous underground pyramid constructed from dark stone, a structure sometimes referred to as the Black Pyramid of Alaska. The story first began appearing in public discussions during the late 20th century, particularly during the 1990s, when several radio programs and alternative research publications began mentioning unusual reports connected to the region. The claims were dramatic. Some versions suggested the pyramid was discovered accidentally during military exploration of underground rock formations. Others described it as an ancient structure buried beneath the mountains, long before modern civilization arrived in North America. In some accounts, the pyramid was said to be even larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. But unlike the Egyptian pyramids, it was supposedly hidden deep underground. Naturally, the story raised many questions. Alaska is an enormous region filled with rugged terrain, glaciers, forests, and mountains. Much of the land remains sparsely populated, and large areas are difficult to explore because of harsh weather and remote geography. If an enormous underground structure really existed somewhere within this wilderness, could it remain hidden? The rumors often point toward areas near Denali, the highest mountain in North America. Denali rises more than 6,000 meters above sea level and dominates the surrounding landscape. The region around the mountain includes vast stretches of protected wilderness, including national parks and remote valleys where human activity is extremely limited. But despite the dramatic claims, there is no archaeological evidence supporting the existence of a buried pyramid anywhere in Alaska. Geologists who study the region are familiar with the rock formations beneath the mountains, which are primarily composed of natural geological structures created by tectonic activity, volcanic processes, and glacial movement over millions of years. These formations can sometimes create unusual shapes underground. Large chambers, steep ridges, or pyramid-like peaks form naturally through erosion. But none of these formations resemble the kind of engineered structure described in the rumors. So where did the story originate? One possibility involves a misunderstanding of geological surveys conducted in Alaska during the Cold War. During the mid-20th century, military and scientific teams conducted seismic and geological research throughout the region. These studies sometimes mapped unusual underground features, including large rock formations and fault structures. If such data were misinterpreted or taken out of context, it could easily give rise to stories about hidden structures beneath the mountains. Another factor may be the powerful influence of mythology and imagination. Alaska's wilderness is immense, mysterious, and largely unexplored compared with more densely populated regions of the world. When people imagine what might lie hidden beneath such landscapes, their ideas often expand beyond what science has confirmed. Stories of lost cities, buried civilizations, and hidden monuments have appeared in many cultures throughout history. the Black Pyramid legend simply adapts that tradition to the remote mountains of Alaska. In recent years, satellite imagery and geological mapping technologies have become far more advanced. Scientists can now analyze terrain, rock formations, and underground structures with remarkable accuracy. Yet none of these studies have revealed any pyramid-like structure buried beneath the Alaskan wilderness. The rumor persists nonetheless, partly because it captures something timeless about human curiosity. The idea that somewhere beneath the mountains, beyond the reach of roads and cities, there might exist something ancient and hidden. A structure built long ago. A monument concealed beneath stone and ice. Whether the Black Pyramid exists only as legend or as a misunderstood fragment of geological information, the story continues to circulate among those fascinated by unexplained mysteries. And in a place as vast and remote as Alaska, where entire valleys remain rarely visited and mountain ranges stretch endlessly across the horizon, it is easy to see why such stories endure. Because when landscapes are that large, and that quiet imagination has plenty of room to wander. The Giant of Kandahar. In the rugged mountains of southern Afghanistan, stories sometimes circulate among soldiers and travelers about strange encounters in remote valleys and caves. These landscapes are vast and unforgiving, steep ridges, rocky plateaus, and isolated regions where few people travel regularly. In places like these, it is easy for rumors and legends to grow. One of the most widely shared modern legends from the region is known as the story of the Giant of Kandahar. According to the tale, the event supposedly took place during the early years of the conflict in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. A military patrol was reportedly sent to investigate the disappearance of another group of soldiers who had gone missing while exploring a remote, mountainous area near the city of Kandahar. The search team moved through the rugged terrain, climbing narrow paths and scanning the surrounding cliffs for signs of the missing patrol. Eventually, they reached a cave. Outside the cave, the soldiers reportedly discovered strange evidence, broken equipment and scattered remains suggesting that something violent had taken place. What happened next is where the story becomes extraordinary. According to the legend, a massive humanoid creature suddenly emerged from the cave. Witnesses later described the figure as extremely tall, perhaps 3 to 4 meters in height, with long reddish hair and a thick beard. The creature was said to be powerfully built and carrying a large spear-like weapon. In some versions of the story, the giant attacked one of the soldiers before the rest of the team responded with gunfire. After an intense struggle, the creature was reportedly killed. The story then claims that military authorities quickly secured the area and transported the enormous body away using a helicopter, along with other evidence collected from the cave. And then, according to the legend, the entire incident was classified. No official reports were released, no photographs were published, and the soldiers involved were supposedly instructed not to discuss what they had seen. Over time, the story began circulating through podcasts, internet forums, and documentaries focused on unexplained mysteries. The idea of a giant humanoid creature living in the mountains captured public imagination quickly. Some listeners connected the story to ancient traditions describing giants in mythology and religious texts. Others suggested the tale might be linked to folklore from Central Asia, where stories of large wild beings have appeared in regional legends for centuries. However, when journalists and researchers attempted to verify the story, they encountered a major problem. There are no confirmed military records documenting such an encounter. No official statements from the armed forces involved in the region mention the discovery of a giant creature. No credible photographs or physical evidence have ever been presented. Most investigators who have examined the story believe it originated from fictional or exaggerated accounts that gradually spread online. In many cases, stories shared through anonymous sources or secondhand testimony can grow larger with each retelling. Details change, descriptions become more dramatic, and eventually the story begins to feel almost historical, even though the original source may have been speculation or storytelling. That does not mean the legend itself is uninteresting. On the contrary, the popularity of the Kandahar Giant story reflects a long human tradition of imagining unknown creatures living in remote places. Throughout history, mountains, forests, and deserts have inspired stories about beings that dwell beyond the boundaries of ordinary settlements. In ancient cultures, these stories often took the form of giants, large figures representing strength, danger, or the mysterious forces of nature. In modern times, those same ideas sometimes appear in new forms, adapted to contemporary settings such as military expeditions or unexplored landscapes. Afghanistan's mountainous terrain certainly provides the kind of environment where such legends might arise. The country contains some of the most rugged geography in the world, including remote valleys and cave systems that have been difficult to explore fully. But despite the dramatic claims surrounding the Kandahar giant, no physical evidence has ever supported the existence of such a creature. Most historians and researchers therefore consider the story to be modern folklore, a legend that emerged during a period of conflict and uncertainty. Still, the story continues to circulate. A tale of soldiers entering a cave in the mountains, a sudden encounter with something enormous, and a mystery that, according to the legend, was quietly removed before the world could ever see it. Whether viewed as myth, rumor, or imaginative storytelling, the giant of Kandahar remains an example of how quickly extraordinary stories can grow in places where mystery already fills the landscape. The giant skeletons of Lovelock Cave. In the dry desert landscape of northern Nevada, surrounded by sagebrush, volcanic hills, and wide open skies, there is a cave that has been the center of archaeological discoveries and unusual stories for more than a century. The cave sits near the small town of Lovelock, Nevada, and is known today as Lovelock Cave. From the outside, the entrance looks modest, opening into a rocky hillside that overlooks the desert floor. But inside the cave lies a record of human activity that stretches back thousands of years. For ancient people living in the Great Basin region, caves like this offered shelter from harsh weather and a safe place to store food and tools. Over time, layers of artifacts accumulated inside: basket fragments, stone tools, animal bones, and eventually human remains. The cave first attracted widespread attention in the early 20th century, when miners began removing large deposits of bat guano from the site. At the time, guano was commonly used as fertilizer, and the deposits inside Lovelock Cave were valuable. As workers dug deeper into the cave floor, they began uncovering objects buried beneath centuries of debris. Soon, archaeologists arrived to investigate. Excavations in the cave revealed an extraordinary collection of artifacts from ancient Great Basin cultures. The dry climate inside the cave had preserved organic materials unusually well, including woven sandals, duck decoys carved from reeds, and fragments of ancient baskets. Among the discoveries were also human burials. Some of these skeletons appeared larger than average, which eventually led to rumors about giant skeletons being discovered inside the cave. Stories began circulating that the cave had once contained the remains of people over 7 feet tall, with unusual physical features such as reddish hair. These stories quickly spread beyond Nevada, becoming part of a broader tradition of tales about giant skeletons, discovered in ancient sites across North America. But when archaeologists studied the Lovelock remains more carefully, the evidence told a more complex story. The skeletons found in the cave belonged to members of the Northern Paiute culture, whose ancestors had lived in the region for thousands of years. While some individuals were indeed tall by the standards of ancient populations, their size remained within the normal range of human variation. The reddish color sometimes observed in preserved hair was not a natural hair color at all. Instead, it was the result of chemical changes caused by long-term exposure to minerals in the cave environment. Over time, dark hair can fade or shift in color as it reacts with soil and air, producing shades of reddish-brown that were originally interpreted as evidence of unusual physical traits. Still, the legend of giant skeletons continued to circulate. Part of the reason may lie in local indigenous traditions. Northern Paiute oral history includes stories about a group of enemies known as the Si Te Ka, a people described as large, aggressive, and sometimes associated with caves in the region. According to the tradition, the Paiute eventually defeated this group after driving them into a cave and sealing the entrance. Some storytellers later connected this legend to Lovelock Cave itself. However, historians note that oral traditions can evolve over time, and linking them directly to specific archaeological discoveries requires careful evidence. What remains clear is that Lovelock Cave is an extremely important archaeological site. Excavations have revealed evidence of human occupation dating back more than 4,000 years, offering a glimpse into the lives of people who adapted to the challenging desert environment of the Great Basin. The artifacts recovered from the cave are now preserved in museums, where researchers continue to study them. Visitors to the region can still see the cave entrance, standing quietly above the Nevada desert. Inside, the layers of earth once held centuries of history, tools, clothing, and traces of daily life left behind by generations of people who called this landscape home. The stories of giant skeletons may have grown larger with time, but the real history of Lovelock Cave is no less fascinating. It is a story about ancient communities, survival in a harsh environment, and the way archaeological discoveries can sometimes become intertwined with legend. And like many mysteries of the past, it reminds us that separating fact from folklore is often part of the journey toward understanding history itself.